In the 5th century BC, the period following the Greek victory over the Persians but before the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians experienced an energetic period of creativity and cultural ascendancy. It's known as the Golden Age of Athens. It was short-lived, a period of about 50 years, before the war between Athens and Sparta resulted in the downfall of Athenian hegemony in the Greek world and their subjugation to their Spartan rivals. From that brief period, we receive some of the jewels of Western civilization. It is often said that the two greatest among these jewels from this time are the Parthenon and the Oresteia, the only extant trilogy of Greek drama. So, on the one hand, we have a monument to the Athenians that is set into ancient marble, which still defiantly stands today, and on the other, we have the monument that comes to us in the form of verse, the written word. The Oresteia is a gripping story about the cycles of revenge and retaliation, about murder and matricide, about the cursed house of the Atreidae. This monument to the Greek culture is not solely contained within the story or the characters. The Oresteia is a monument to the Greek language and the poetry of that language. As a young man, Aeschylus fought the Persians at Marathon. Years later, he witnessed the destruction of Athens at the hands of the Persians. They sacked the city, they destroyed the shrines of the Acropolis. He went on to fight against them again at Plataea, where they were finally and decisively defeated. And in the wake of the Persian Wars, Aeschylus is one of the young men who brings forth this golden age of creativity and optimism. His plays are part of that cultural abundance that can only be found in peace, but his writing also comes out of his own experiences with the dark side of the human condition that he found in war. Violence, reciprocal cycles of violence, the return to savagery, and the uncomfortable truth that civilization is founded on savagery. Accordingly, the translator, Robert Fagles, in his commentary on the text, calls the Oresteia a rite of passage, the movement from savagery to civilization. We always have to keep in mind the religious origin of the tragic form whenever we approach one of these Greek tragedies, because this is the reason why they deal with these eternal themes that the religious rites are always concerned with. Even after millennia of civilization, all of us are born savage, so to speak. The various traditional rites of passage that we find cross-culturally, in which the line between an older boy and a young man is clearly delineated, that sort of represents this transformation from savagery to civilization on an individual level. You go through the rite of passage and you're no longer a child, which means you're no longer a being whose impulsivity society will tolerate, whose impatience will tolerate, or whose excesses and breaches of etiquette we will tolerate, which is all to say, whose savagery we will tolerate. Now you're a man, you're a civilized human being, an adult, which means you have responsibility for your actions. That's the meaning of a rite of passage. And these were the kinds of perennial insights that the Dionysian tragedies are supposed to impart to us. So that's one sense in which it can be a rite of passage. But there's also a grand sense of the Oresteia, which is not just an individual rite of passage, but the movement from savagery to civilization playing out on a world historical scale. So it's both a psychological truth and a historical truth that is encapsulated in this story. A myth that tells us in allegory of a kind of psychohistorical development, the movement from the ancient laws of vengeance, of blood paid by blood, to a truly civic life. This is conceptualized in the Oresteia as the younger law superseding the older law. Within the framework of the older law, it's enforced on the level of familial relations. So one avenges one's own blood. One identifies with one's own family. You repay a slight to one member of the family as it's taken as a slight to all members of the family. And importantly, one inherits the consequences of actions taken by one's ancestors. This type of older law, if society is to be born, civic life, that type of older law has to be subordinated to civic law, which means a transfamilial law. Before the time of the city, each family, even if they existed in a state of relative peace with one another, are ultimately competitive. To establish the city-state, therefore, made of multiple families, requires that one take a standpoint above any one of the competing families' perspectives, above any one bloodline's perspective. Civic life in the ancient Greek world was established on a purely religious basis. There was no separation between church and state. Such a statement wouldn't even make sense to the ancient Greek. All of the ministers of state were also priestly offices, as well as political. All of the institutions of state are religious institutions. One's piety or impiety is thought to have a direct effect on the prosperity of the polis. The Greek city-state is established at the point at which multiple families join themselves together based on a religious association that supersedes the family. It's a confederation of gods that comes with this confederation of families. The lares, that was the term for the heroes and spirits that guarded one's family, these were now conceived as inferior in power to the gods over the entire city. And so by forming the city and embracing the power of the city, the Greek had to place the commitments required by their bloodline into subordination to the commitments required by the polity. We also see this movement from savagery to civilization in the use of language in the three parts of the Oresteia, in the way that the story is told. Michael Davis, in his lectures on Aeschylus, which I highly recommend, and I'll leave a link in the description, Michael Davis describes this shift. The language in Agamemnon, the first play, is poetic, complex, and lush, whereas by the time we get to the final play of the trilogy, the Eumenides, the language is rather straightforward. In Robert Fagel's commentary on the text, he echoes this sentiment about the Agamemnon. Quote, Aeschylus is often swept off his feet by his own creative exultation. We must surrender to him, let him sweep us on like a storm at sea, often violating our intellectual bent for precision and lucidity, often baffling when his genius seems to burst upon the majestic flow of his dramatic theme. End quote. And so the language in the first play of the trilogy is very rich in imagery, and it's almost impenetrable upon a first reading. Frankly speaking, it's at times difficult to know just exactly what's going on. This play, like all Greek dramas, is, we have to keep in mind, it's a vehicle for dialogues and beautiful speeches. Again, much of the action takes place either before the play begins or off stage. As the chorus recounts events through their beautiful verses, actions in the present begin to blur with fears over the future, and metaphors for a feeling or for an inner state intertwine with religious allegories, and the personal history of the main characters merges with the theogonies. The theogonies are the accounts of the origins of the gods. The Agamemnon play is sort of like a pyroclastic flow of verse, and it is beautiful, but it's not known for its clarity. We might recall here Nietzsche's remarks on the clarity of Greek writing and how this was not something God-given or gods given, but something that they had to struggle to achieve. He writes this in Human All Too Human, second book, Miscellaneous Maxims and Opinions. This is number 219. Quote, We are easily led astray by the renowned Greek clearness, transparency, simplicity, and order, by their crystal-like naturalness and crystal-like art, into believing that all these gifts were bestowed on the Greeks. Yet no statement could be more hasty and more untenable. The history of prose from Gorgias to Demosthenes shows a course of toiling and wrestling towards the light, from the obscure, overloaded, and tasteless, reminding one of the labor of heroes who had to construct the first roads through forest and bog. It was the achievement of Homer to liberate the Greeks from Asiatic pomp and gloom, and to have attained the clearness of architecture in details great and small. Nor was it by any means thought easy to say anything in pure and illuminating style. Since the struggle towards the light from an almost native twilight is Greek, a thrill of jubilation runs through the people when they hear a laconic sentence, the language of elegy or the maxims of the 7 wise men. Hence they were so fond of giving precepts in verse, a practice that we find objectionable. This was the true Apolline task of the Hellenic spirit, with the aim of rising superior to the perils of meter and the obscurity which is otherwise characteristic of poetry. Simplicity, flexibility, and sobriety were wrestled for and not given by nature to this people. End quote. In other words, to extend Nietzsche's point somewhat, because he doesn't mention Aeschylus by name here, We can see the change in the language over the course of this trilogy as yet another representation of the movement from savagery to civilization. The Agamemnon is like the hazy vision of a mad prophet. As Davis notes in his lecture, the gods in the first play are almost indistinguishable from their effect, whether that might be a natural phenomenon, such as Hephaestus standing for fire, or an event, such as Ares standing in for war. The gods are not so much personalities at this time, but forces. The language in this first play is the unclear thinking of a more primordial way of life, a more primordial religiosity. It has mixed metaphors, past and future bleeding into one another, allegory merging with narrative, feeling blending with fact, and so on. Just as the entire Greek culture originates in this sort of shamanic way of experiencing the world and had to struggle into a clear-headed, sober view of reality, as Nietzsche argues, this is represented by the Oresteia. By the time of the final play, the Eumenides, we have a very clear, straightforward narrative and a familiar literary style, the courtroom drama. With all of that being said, that's why it is difficult to read this trilogy in chronological order. I still would recommend you do so, but I would do as Fagel suggests and embrace the excesses and the disorientation of the first part of the trilogy. If you must, sort of advance through it with the aid of commentary and secondary sources, but be willing to be disoriented. Before we dive into the text, I want to consider the other major theme of this trilogy, which is that vengeance begets vengeance, we might say. As with Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, this play begins after much of the action has taken place, after the inciting incident has already occurred, we'll say. The vengeance that is taken in the play, the Agamemnon, is to repay events that happened at the start of the Trojan War, the wrongs committed even before the war started. And in fact, you could see much of what happens in the Agamemnon as springing from events that even occurred in previous generations. The chorus says near the beginning of the first play, quote, "Still some say that heaven would never stoop to punish men who trample the lovely grace of things untouchable. How wrong they are! A curse burns bright on crime. Full blown, the father's crimes will blossom, burst into the sons. Bastions of wealth are no defense for the man who treads the grand altar of justice down and out of sight." End quote. The word justice, Dikê, is used more often in Aeschylus Oresteia than in any other Greek drama which has survived. This is the fundamental concern of the work. And yet, we can't really approach the Oresteia with our modern, somewhat abstract concepts of justice, as if justice were simply a general idea of harmony or of a moral social order or something like that. We have to accustom ourselves to the ancient concept of justice, which we have discussed on the podcast before, and which was considerably closer to what we in modernity would call, frankly, vengeance. This ancient conception of justice was of great concern to Nietzsche, and we can put it in the plainest terms with the metaphor of settling the scales. Justice is always achieved as a reaction. What does this mean? Well, we cry out for justice only when an injustice has occurred. As James Joyce writes, quote, "Where there is a reconciliation, there must first have been a sundering." End quote. So where there is justice, there must first be an injustice. Justice is an act of correction, we might say. So justice necessarily implies that the scales have been unbalanced. Someone has wronged someone else, which is to say they've done something which was not in their right. One of the meanings of Dikê is right. Once the imbalance occurs, one can then claim the right of justice, the right to rebalance the scales and repay the crime. And this repayment always happens by way of analogy. They killed one of our number, we'll kill one of them. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. There's the saying in modern English vernacular of poetic justice. But you could say that justice always has a poetic aspect, a balancing aspect. The achievement of justice is the rhyming verse with the initial injustice. It's the reconciliation that comes after the sundering. But in the very example that I just gave, right, they killed one of us, let's kill one of them, one is necessarily using violence against one of a group as a stand-in for the whole group. Or, as in the Oresteia, punishing the next generation for the sins of the father. As the chorus says in those lines we read a bit earlier, the crimes of the father are inherited by the son. The wrongs, the imbalancing of the scale, that continues, that crime continues across generations, such that if someone wronged your father, you could be in your right to kill, for example, their son. So the wrongs of a bloodline are inherited, and the right of vengeance is also inherited. And this is sort of the logic of reciprocal violence. And the interesting thing about all of this is that the ethos of reciprocal violence, ideally speaking, ought to be to prevent injustice, wouldn't it? It would reduce the likelihood of someone doing something beyond their right if they know there's an escalatory potential involved with reciprocal violence. But the eternal problem is that once this process of reciprocal violence has begun and there's a victim and a victimizer, when the victim seeks out justice, this never seems to end the cycle. When we seek to recompense ourselves or our family after having been wronged in some way, seldom do we think of how to perfectly equalize the scales. Instead, we think of how to one-up the enemy. Because after all, their initial injustice, their initial crime, well, that was the incitement to our own just retribution of the crime. And that means you feel you get to go sort of above and beyond the initial crime. I mean, as an example of this, we might think of the descendants of Cain in the Bible, who declare, if you insult one of us, we'll kill 7 of you. If you kill one of us, we will kill 7 times 7 of you, right? So that's not just one-upping the enemy, it's 7-upping the enemy, I guess we might say. And so, since the avenging party then exceeds their right in achieving justice by killing 7 of you in exchange for an insult, the scales still aren't balanced, right? They're now tipped in their own favor. And that produces a response from the other side, because now they have a right to tip the scales again, and on and on and on. As the chorus says in the Agamemnon, quote, "Ancient violence longs to breed. New violence comes. When its fatal hour comes, the demon comes to take her toll. No war, no force, no prayer can hinder the midnight fury stamped with parent fury moving through the house." End quote. So in the term fury in these verses, I mean, it's obviously there's a reference to the emotional state, vindictive rage, but there's also the mythical beings known as the Furies. We talked a bit about the Furies. They're also known as the Erinyes. This is when we discuss the Oedipus plays of Sophocles. The Furies somewhat figure into that play as well, although they don't actually appear in the play. And so the elements of these lines we just read that it is mentioned, there's an allusion to the fact that the very house of Agamemnon is stained with blood. There's a curse that lingers over his whole bloodline. And the Furies are these wrathful chthonic deities, and they are associated with the fury of a parent, which is apropos to the Agamemnon because Clytemnestra, the wife of Agamemnon, plays the role of a fury in human form, so to speak. And we'll discuss that more deeply in a bit. But the point I wanted to hammer home here at the beginning is that so long as the only operative force is pride, which always comes part and parcel with the kind of honor culture in which one is charged to recompense the wrongs against oneself and one's clan, the score can never be settled, as long as pride is the force that's operating. The Oresteia begins against that backdrop of a cycle that has begun long before the play. The most immediate incident in the background of the Agamemnon is the sacrifice of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, which happened 10 years prior. Agamemnon is obviously a famous figure in Greek mythology. He was the king of Argos. Before the events of the play, Agamemnon fought in the Trojan War. He gathered troops in support of his brother Menelaus to attack the Trojans after Paris absconded with Helen, the wife of Menelaus. Paris obviously commits an injustice in doing this, but one of the important things to understand is that the main injustice that he commits under the Greek law is that Paris violated the social contract because there's a sacred duty that the host has to the guest. There's also a reciprocal duty that moves from guest to host. So it's not just infidelity that is at issue here, but the fact that if Paris's action of stealing the wife of his host was to go unavenged, then the entire social institution of guest and host would be thrown into disarray. There was no equivalent to an inn or hotel at this time. When one traveled, you would find accommodations by arranging to stay with another family of the same social station. And so the Greek civilization requires everyone to respect the rules of that arrangement. And it's also worth noting, the god that is in charge of that social institution of guest and host is Zeus. That's one of his spheres that he rules over. Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon go to war. This is the subject of Homer's epic, the Iliad. What concerns us here is an incident, however, at the beginning of this conflict, when the two brothers reach Aulis, and they're about to launch their invasion. But unfortunately, nature thwarts them. The winds and the tides do not permit them to set sail for Troy, and the prophet Calchas receives a vision from the gods that Artemis is angry at Agamemnon and Menelaus, and that if they wish to set sail and achieve victory, Agamemnon is called to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. He does, and they set sail. This would seem to be the primary motivation of Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife and his eventual murderer. She wishes to avenge the death of her daughter Iphigenia, who is so callously sacrificed by Agamemnon. But that's not her only motive. There are at least 3 potential motives that we'll talk about. Another one is that while Agamemnon is away fighting in Troy for 10 years, Clytemnestra is wooed by Aegisthus. She begins a love affair with him, and Aegisthus is Agamemnon's cousin, and he wants the throne of Argos for himself. And he wants the throne actually for a very good reason, and that reason goes back to the founding of the house of Atreus. Atreus was the father of Agamemnon, so Aegisthus's uncle. Atreus had a brother, Thyestes, who stole Atreus's wife and attempted to usurp the throne. And so in retaliation, Atreus banished Thyestes for his betrayal. But then later, he invited him back to Argos with his children as a sort of apparent gesture of reconciliation. And there he promised them a great feast. In secret, Atreus then slaughtered the children of Thyestes, all except for Aegisthus, to manage to escape. And at the banquet, he served Thyestes the flesh of his own children. When Thyestes discovered this horrifying truth, that he had eaten his own children, Thyestes cursed Atreus and his house, and fled with Aegisthus, his only surviving son. So now, in the next generation, Aegisthus seduces the wife of his cousin Agamemnon, the son of the man who killed his siblings and forced his father into cannibalism. And together, Aegisthus and Clytemnestra conspire to get revenge against Agamemnon. Clytemnestra wants revenge for the death of her daughter, and Aegisthus wants to get revenge on behalf of his family. But the cycle of violence actually goes back before this. The founder of the entire family line, of which both Atreus and Thyestes were descended, and thus both Agamemnon and Aegisthus are both descendants of, was Tantalus. Tantalus is a mythic figure who fed his son's flesh to the gods, and as punishment for this, he's condemned to an awful fate in Hades. It's from his name that we get the word tantalize, because his punishment is to be tantalized. To be tantalized is to be, enticed by something and to desire it, but to find it just out of reach. And that's the punishment of Tantalus in the underworld. He forever has delicious fruit hanging over his head whose branches recede from his reach whenever he tries to grab hold of one, and he has refreshing water at his feet, but the water level recedes below him whenever he tries to drink from it. And so the entire family line of the House of Atreus springs from this barbaric bloodline of Tantalus, which has its very origins in cannibalism, carried out as a slight and offense against the gods themselves. But we can even go back further than this, because on some level, this chain of vengeance begins in the Theogonies. The first ruler of the cosmos was Uranus, who was overthrown and castrated by his son Kronos, the first of the Titans. And it is worth noting that in Hesiod's Theogony, this incident is said to be the origin of the Furies. The Furies are born when the blood of Uranus, spilled during his castration, falls to Earth, to Gaia, as if the soil is somehow seeded by the blood. Out of this blood of a son betraying a father, the Furies are born. So that's an interesting note about all this. But then Kronos becomes the new ruler of the cosmos. And the most widely known story about Kronos that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is that he engages in cannibalism. He eats his own children. He hears a prophecy that he's destined to be overthrown by his own son, which, Kronos overthrew his father. And so Kronos eats every child that his wife and sister, Rhea, bears. And so Rhea, to put a stop to this, conceals their last child, who is Zeus. She feeds Kronos a rock instead of the infant. Zeus then grows to adulthood in secret and eventually returns to defeat Kronos and forces him to vomit up all of Zeus's siblings. Kronos is then shackled beneath the earth with the other titans. Now, a number of things about these myths should interest us. For one, there's an obvious observation that the cycle of violence goes back to the very origins of the universe for the Greeks. Their stories about the birth of the pantheon are just characterized by continuous war of father against son and brother against brother. But there's something more specific here to notice. For one, the motif of cannibalism, both through trickery and through conscious intention, and both of one's own children and of other people's children, and also the fact that it's the mother, Rhea, who intervenes to stop this process, who intervenes to stop the continual eating of her children, who facilitates the eventual defeat of the cannibalistic father, Kronos. As Nietzsche puts it in Birth of Tragedy, the world of Aeschylus could be defined this way, quote, "All that exists is just and unjust and equally justified in both," end quote. And Fagles contrasts that type of sentiment with the moral universe of Homer, as it is presented in the Iliad. In Homer, the dark incident of Iphigenia's sacrifice is completely omitted, and the relevant moral facts that we're supposed to understand as we read the Iliad are the clearly unjust abduction of Helen and the righteous retribution against the Trojans. And so there's a sort of moral clarity in Homer. Now, obviously, a deep reading of the Iliad will bring out a lot of the nuance and shades of gray, but it's very different from Aeschylus's Agamemnon. This is not the story of the obviously evil Agamemnon being justly assassinated by the righteous Clytemnestra and, her lover Aegisthus, who justly avenges his father. That's not the moral feeling we get in the play. But on the other hand, Agamemnon's actions are not obviously justified either. I mean, he sacrifices his child to appease the gods, and that's something that he can justify as necessary for the war against the Trojans to begin. And obviously he's a hero to all of Argos as its rightful ruler. And, further from our modern perspective, we would also plea on behalf of Agamemnon that he's certainly in no way responsible from the barbaric actions of his father Atreus. But on the other hand, Clytemnestra would argue that Agamemnon did not have to sacrifice his daughter. He could have chosen not to set sail and go to war. He could have chosen his family as the ultimate value, in other words, over the political as the ultimate value, right? He could have chosen the older law over the younger. And Aegisthus also, he wouldn't see things the way that we do. To him, the whole line of Atreus is guilty. And so the assassins have their reasons, Agamemnon had his reasons, and Aeschylus does not really litigate the justice of the act here, the assassination here in the first play. The ambivalence of the play is shown in a very peculiar moment when the chorus, which is made up of a dozen old men from Argos, they split into 12 individual voices as an expression of their indecision over what is to be done, which is, if I recall correctly, the only time in Greek drama where this happens, where the chorus splits into 12 individual voices. So they don't know how to judge the situation. They don't have the knowledge to judge, and they don't have the power to judge. And so they fall into sort of dissension and disorientation, which I think is a very important detail to bring up here in light of what happens later in the final play. Now, finally, there's another innocent soul that's thrown into the bargain in this case, and that is the prophetess Cassandra. She's the only remaining major character in the first play that we haven't really mentioned yet, and she's one of the most famous characters in Greek drama. And she's also the third motivation for Clytemnestra's betrayal. Cassandra is the daughter of Priam, the king of Troy. Agamemnon captures her and takes her as a concubine after having conquered and pillaged the city. This is a final source of jealousy and resentment for Clytemnestra, with which she justifies her plan to murder Agamemnon. You've probably heard the term Cassandra complex. This is a psychological condition where one feels a sense of impending doom that no one else can perceive. And so Cassandra, the prophetess, when she, upon her arrival in Argos, she predicts that she will die, and that she'll die along with Agamemnon. And one of the interesting things about Cassandra, given that she is such a famous character, is that she doesn't really act in this play, or she's not really an active force. She is acted upon. In fact, virtually all of the characters in the first part, except for Clytemnestra, are passive. Their actions are either provoked by Clytemnestra or they're guided by Clytemnestra. She's the only character who really does anything. Cassandra is really no different from any of the other characters in that respect. What's special about her is that, unlike Agamemnon, she can see her own impending doom with prophetic clarity. And she also knows there is nothing she can do to stop it. And so, in spite of how opaque the language is and sort of the construction of the first part of the Oresteia, in spite of how difficult to understand the Agamemnon can be, the narrative can really be explained in a sentence or two. Agamemnon returns home to Argos with his concubine Cassandra, victorious after 2 years at war in Troy, only to be caught by his treacherous wife Clytemnestra while he is bathing, who binds him in a web of cloth and stabs him to death. She then kills Cassandra as well, and then Aegisthus and Clytemnestra gloat over this act and the fact that Iphigenia has been avenged and Aegisthus has rightfully reclaimed his throne. Very simple narrative. What is significant in the first story is the archetypal significance as it unfolds before us, and the way that the verses of the chorus and the speeches of the characters swirl about with the moral paradoxes of this ancient cycle of reciprocal violence as it is once again reenacted. The Oresteia begins with the sighting of signal fires. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, it's a similar concept as the signal fires that dispatch the message from Gondor to Rohan. A fire is lit atop one mountain that then prompts another fire upon another mountain, and so on and so forth until a signal fire is visible from Argos, that Troy has been defeated. This image, I think, is just so perfect to begin the trilogy because it's an image of radiating cause and effect. It's a fire being lit that causes another to be lit and causes another to be lit. The message carried by the fire is fundamentally a message of violence. We have defeated the enemy. We have triumphed. This is what begins the play. Then, as Clytemnestra is in the shrine, sort of giving prayers and sacrifices, a herald arrives that tells of Agamemnon's victory. We might remember Aristotle's description of the aspects of tragedy, such as reversal. So this should be happy news, but we know that it's the beginning of the end for Agamemnon. Clytemnestra is eager to greet her husband upon his return home, not because she is his loving wife, but because she is eager to assassinate him. Furthermore, the herald tells us of the glories of the victory over the Trojans, but then he goes on to say that on the return voyage, all of the ships have been destroyed in a storm, except for one galley, that of Agamemnon, which is on its way. And so, by turns, the moment is both sweet and bitter. It's the sort of the caprice of the gods, the mystery to the mortal mind as to why the gods do what they do. That laces the play. Why did Artemis demand the death of Iphigenia? Was it some sin of Agamemnon? Was it because the Trojans were beloved to Artemis? We don't know. And neither does Agamemnon. Why did the gods bless the Greeks and allow them victory over the Trojans, only to destroy their entire army on the return voyage? We don't know, and neither do they. All they have are the hazy words of raving prophets. Then there is another enigmatic scene, the entry of Agamemnon. Clytemnestra orders that tapestries be laid out upon the entrance to the palace for Agamemnon to walk upon as he enters. But these tapestries are sacred to the gods, and it would be hubris to walk upon them. It would be akin to setting oneself up as a god king, equivalent to Zeus. Agamemnon's reaction to this is to piously express that Greek sense of moderation. Quote, "What am I, some barbarian peacocking out of Asia? Never cross my paths with robes and draw the lightning. Never. Only the gods deserve the pomps of honor and stiff brocades of fame. To walk on them, I am human, and it makes my pulses stir with dread." End quote. To do such a thing is more fitting of a barbarian king of Asia who thinks himself divine, not a man who knows that by doing such a thing he draws the lightning of Zeus. And then he utters that sentiment that we hear at the end of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Quote, "Call no man blessed until he ends his life in peace fulfilled." End quote. So, call no man lucky until he's dead. In other words, Agamemnon knows that it is pride that brings down heroes and kings, that the tragic hero is the one whose pride exceeds his right, exceeds his sense of piety or justice. And so he resists. He says, "I'm not going to cross this line." But Clytemnestra pushes him. She says, "Would your opponent, Priam, have shown such restraint?" And Agamemnon eventually says, "Well, no, he wouldn't." And then she asks him, "Well, why would you fear to do so?" And he says, "It would look impious to the common people." But would Priam have cared about the condemnations of the common people? Well, no, he wouldn't. And so she seduces him sort of to this impiety. She bargains him into it until eventually she says the line, quote, "Oh, give way. The power is yours if you surrender all of your own free will to me." End quote. And so this is what I mean by Clytemnestra being the main actor in this drama. Even this apparent act of audacious hubris that Agamemnon eventually does carry out, he eventually does walk upon the tapestry sacred to the gods, is in a way his surrender to Clytemnestra, which she then paradoxically portrays as his ascension to power. She praises him as he does this, quote, "And you are Zeus, when Zeus tramples the bitter virgin grape for new wine." End quote. And shortly thereafter, she prays to Zeus, quote, "Zeus, master of all fulfillment, now fulfill our prayers. Speed our rites to their fulfillment once and for all." End quote. But, of course, what has she been praying for? She's been praying for success in assassinating Agamemnon. So in invoking this in front of him, she is, unbeknownst to him, asking the gods for their sanction to kill him. And to speak just for myself here, I get the sense of mounting dread throughout the Agamemnon. I mean, the chorus seems to have it too. They immediately after this incident of Agamemnon walking upon the sacred tapestries, the chorus speaks of the terror beating in their hearts. And this is even before they have a clear reason for that terror. The chorus does not know that Clytemnestra's sacrifices, her prayers to Zeus, are actually in entreaty to sanction her bloody murder of the king. They're not prayers for the well-being of the king. But the chorus still knows that there is something wrong. There's something deeply wrong about this. And they invoke the image once again of the Furies. Quote, "Still, it's chanting, beating so deep in the heart, this dirge of the Furies. Oh, dear God, not fit for the lyre, its own master. It kills our spirit, kills our hopes, and it's real, true, no fantasy. Stark terror whirls in the brain, and the end is coming. Justice comes to birth. I pray my fears prove false, and fall and die, and never come to birth." End quote. It's when they hear the words of Cassandra that the chorus is able to begin to locate the source of this dread. Cassandra has been blessed by Apollo with visions. That is why she is a prophetess. And her scene after Agamemnon and Clytemnestra leave, it is her alone with the chorus, and she recounts the doom of Troy and how none of the sacrifices burned by her father Priam could forestall that doom. As with her rapidly approaching death, she foretold the coming of the doom of Troy. She foretold it to her countrymen. And yet again, there was nothing that could be done to avert that outcome. And then she begins to prophesize her own imminent death and the death of Agamemnon. Quote, "I tell you, someone plots revenge. A lion who lacks a lion's heart. He sprawled at home in the royal lair and set a trap for the Lord on his return. My Lord, I must wear his yoke. I am his slave. The Lord of the men of war, he obliterated Troy. He is so blind, so lost to that detestable hellhound, who pricks her ears and fawns, and her tongue draws out glittering words of welcome. No, he cannot see the stroke that fury's hiding, stealth and murder. What outrage! The woman kills the man, end quote. And so here, she directly calls Clytemnestra herself a fury, and seems to be very obviously speaking about Clytemnestra, but the chorus cannot or will not believe this. They say, well, Gods forbid if these words are true. And Cassandra answers, quote, you pray, and they close in to kill, end quote. And one of the things the chorus says that shows that they can't even conceive that the assassin could be Clytemnestra, even though the possibility is staring them right in the face. They ask Cassandra, well, which man is behind this plot you speak of? And Cassandra continues to relate her visions. She struggles and stumbles through the scene as though an unseen spirit or force is tearing at her robes. Quote, his fire sears me, sweeps me again, the torture. Apollo, Lord of light, you burn, you blind me. Agony. She is the lioness. She rears on her hind legs. She beds with the wolf. When her lion king goes ranging, she will kill me. Aye, the torture. She is mixing her drugs, adding a measure more of hate for me. She gloats as she whets the sword for him. He brought me home, and we will pay in carnage. End quote. Cassandra then rips off her priestly garments and throws them on the ground before her, and then, after prophesying one last time of her own death and that of Agamemnon's, she gives another prediction, that there is one who will rise up to avenge the both of them, and she is speaking of the son of Agamemnon, Orestes, who in the next play, the Libation Bearers, will return to take revenge against Clytemnestra and Aeschylus. Cassandra then, sort of powerless to resist her fate, slowly goes into the palace. And shortly thereafter, Clytemnestra indeed kills both of them. First, while Agamemnon is bathing, she binds him in cloth. There's a very sort of spider-like quality to Clytemnestra that is often conjured by the verses of the chorus. She sort of binds him up in a web and then stabs him to death, and then shortly thereafter does the same to Cassandra. She emerges from the palace with blood splattered across her forehead, to the horror and recriminations of the old men of the chorus. But she then glories in her act, and she defends what she has done before them. She says, quote, praise me, blame me as you choose. It is all the same. Here is Agamemnon, my husband, made a corpse by this right hand, a masterpiece of justice. Done is done, end quote. Why is justice done? Because, quote, he sacrificed his own child, our daughter, the agony I labored into love, to charm the savage winds of Thrace, end quote. So in spite of the fact that her love affair with Aeschylus was probably a key motivation, and as Cassandra seems to prophetically know, her hatred of Cassandra was also a motivation. But what she cites primarily is that her husband chose, he chose to uphold the law of Zeus, the law of guests and hosts, the patriarchal civic law, this civic institution of Greek society that's really what's at stake in the Trojan War. That is what Agamemnon chose over our own child, the child that through agony I labored into existence. And so we can understand her motivations, but as she goes on to talk about, and in fact to gloat about the murder of Cassandra, who had no agency in the narrative whatsoever, her gloating is actually a bit sickening. She sort of jokes about it. Quote, and here his spear prize, what wonders she beheld. The seer of Apollo shared my husband's bed, his faithful mate, who knelt at the rowing benches, worked by every hand. They have their rewards. He, as you know, and she, the swan of the gods, who lived to sing her latest dying song. His lover lies beside him. She brings a fresh, voluptuous relish to my bed. End quote. After these speeches of Cassandra, Aeschylus enters the scene, but he too is merely passive in comparison to Clytemnestra. And it is certainly a choice on Aeschylus's part to portray things this way, because in other versions of the legend, Aegisthus kills Agamemnon. But in Aeschylus's version, it is all Clytemnestra. Aegisthus simply arrives to reap the rewards of her acts. He is, as she says, Aegisthus is a shield for me. He's an ally that I've inveigled over to my side. So he's like a tool of her vengeance. He's another defense, another justification for her and her actions. But the end of the play is, relatively speaking, somewhat inconclusive, because the chorus cannot accept what Clytemnestra has done, but they have no power to punish her for this or to oppose her. They do not accept her act as just, and they even move to attack Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. But they know they cannot overcome Aegisthus's men, his bodyguard, and ultimately Clytemnestra simply dismisses the old men. She tells them, "Go home. There's nothing you can do. We have all the power now." And so the play ends with a sort of like the moral recriminations of the old men of Argos against Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, but no resolution to anything, other than, except as insofar as there's been a resolution to the story of Clytemnestra seeking vengeance against Agamemnon. And Clytemnestra is the central figure of this entire trilogy in many ways. She is the rage of the archetypal mother against the patriarchal father, who sacrifices, or we might say eats the children for his own glory. Metaphorically speaking, eats the children for his own glory. And, even though this is a society in which Agamemnon's actions would be largely seen as justified, there is a sense in which he is excessive in his conquest of Troy, that he brings excessive suffering upon a noble enemy. And he shows a kind of hubris in taking home this prophetess of Apollo as his slave. And so perhaps in that sense, he invites his fate. There's also the hubris in walking on the tapestries, even as he's convinced to do it by Clytemnestra. He still disrespects the gods in that way. But ultimately, it's not some cosmic sense of justice that destroys Agamemnon. It is justice in the form of Clytemnestra with a sword in her hand. She embodies justice, Dikê, in that old form, the ancient laws of blood, the practice of reciprocating a murder with another murder. Agamemnon prioritized the higher rule than the family, the rule of Zeus, the lord of guest and host, over the familial good. Clytemnestra is the opposite. Her blood, the one she birthed, that's what she prioritizes, and the rule of guests and hosts and preserving the laws of the Olympians, all that be damned. Fegel's summation of this first part of the Oresteia is a beautiful elucidation of the themes we have explored, and the way in which these themes are woven into Aeschylus's language of violent paradox and mixed metaphors. Quote, "The ferocity of action may seem obscured. Memory takes its place and renders action inescapable but frozen. Yet there is a movement too, a choking coil of image and event. It is the poetic justice of the play that every good must seek its opposite and be destroyed, the health that turns to sickness, the beauty that blinds, the theodicy that is a ministry of fear, and things more often go from bad to worst, the wound that breeds more wounds, the hunter who is hunted down and killed. There is a lex talionis, a law of retaliation working in the style as in the action, in the bond between Agamemnon's cruelty and his fate, and the double blow they deal to Greece and Troy, and all to strike against the double-bladed law that the killer must be killed, the law of Zeus that incriminates itself, binding him over to the Furies as they weld the race to ruin. In fact, there is a momentum in the Furies, quote, the terror raging back and back in the future, the stealth, the law of the hearth, the mother," end quote. These menacing phrases, like monolithic, unmovable building blocks, are actually set in motion by the Fury who will construct her edifice, the house of Atreus, or all houses, where the elements of Aeschylus are clashing for control, end quote. And so, the background of the Agamemnon reaches into the mythic past. The past streams backward from the play and manifests itself once again in another act of fury, another vindictive murder, which does not yield to any ethical plea or religious scruples. It simply flows inexorably from the logic of justice as revenge. And in this play, the wrath of the mother is both ultimately just and ultimately unjust. The settling of scores, once again, throws something new, someone new, into the bargain. This time, innocent Cassandra, prophetess of Apollo. And the stage is set for a new act of vengeance that will be undertaken by Orestes, son of Agamemnon. And at first glance, the killing of Cassandra would seem to be completely aside from whatever motives Orestes might have for vengeance. I mean, Clytemnestra killed his father. But we learn in the course of the next play, The Libation Bearers, that Orestes does not just return to take vengeance upon Clytemnestra for personal revenge. He returns because he's been commanded by Apollo. So it just so happens that the god who blessed Cassandra with visions commands Orestes to take his revenge, to come back to Argos and kill those who killed Agamemnon. So following the unjust murder of his prophetess, Cassandra, Apollo is now involved. The next play, The Libation Bearers, is the centerpiece of the Oresteia. And right there we have another mystery or another oddity about the way that Aeschylus has arranged and titled the plays of this trilogy. One could already make the argument that the Agamemnon is perhaps incorrectly titled, because it is the story of the downfall and the death of Agamemnon, but the main character is Clytemnestra. She carries all the action in the story. And here in The Libation Bearers, we might expect the central play of the Oresteia to be called the Orestes. And Orestes here is definitely the most active character. He's the character that provokes all the action. But the play isn't named for him, it's named for the chorus. In the first play, the chorus are the old men of Argos. Here they are a group of slave women brought from Troy. They are the eponymous libation bearers. It's a wonderful question that if you go and read the Oresteia yourself, I invite you to ponder on your own. I don't have a definitive answer. But I would argue that Orestes and his sister Electra could plausibly be included under the name libation bearers, because the play begins at the tomb of Agamemnon. The slave women come bearing libations to pay their respects to the dead Agamemnon, and Electra is with them. And when they arrive, Orestes is actually already there at the tomb because he's been there visiting his father's grave. So the play begins with a bunch of people coming to pay their respects to the dead, to pay their respects to Agamemnon, and that it includes the chorus of slave women, the libation bearers, the titular libation bearers, but it also includes Orestes and Electra. The name of the play, we could say, centers around those who mourn. Once again, that's a rite of passage, to mourn one's dead parent or parents. The action in the play begins at the scene of this mourning. As the libation bearers opens, Orestes and his friend Pylades are visiting the tomb of Agamemnon. Pylades is the prince of the foreign land in which Orestes was raised. The tomb is just outside of the palace at Argos, and thus Orestes and Pylades are paying their respects surreptitiously, without announcing that Orestes has returned. As mentioned, Orestes has received a vision from Apollo, who has told him that if he does not avenge his father, he will be cursed. He will be struck with disease, he will be hounded from place to place, and ultimately driven mad. And so Apollo commands him, kill Clytemnestra and Aegisthus in a like manner to the way that they killed Agamemnon. What would that mean? Kill them by stealth, by surprise, by the sword, with no explanation. And so Orestes has come back to Argos for this purpose, but first he goes to pay his respects at his father's grave. He cuts off 2 locks of his hair and leaves them at the tomb. But then he and Pylades spot the procession of women approaching the tomb, and they hide behind the tomb. And as it turns out, it's his sister Electra among the chorus of libation bearers. They have come because Clytemnestra is having nightmares, which she interprets as a sign of approaching doom. She's ordered her slave women to go pour out libations for Agamemnon, supposing that her killing of him is why she's been cursed with these terrifying dream visions. The chorus recounts the terror that Clytemnestra's dream proclaimed to her. Quote, "The proud dead stir under the earth. They rage against the ones who took their lives, end quote. And a bit further down in the verses, quote, the blood that Mother Earth consumes clots hard. It won't seep through. It breeds revenge, and frenzy goes through the guilty, seething like infection, swarming through the brain, end quote. Electra goes with the chorus to the tomb, and she can't see Orestes because he's hiding, and she prays in the course of her ritual mourning for her brother Orestes to return and for Agamemnon's death to be avenged. And then something strange happens. She finds the locks of Orestes' hair, and she says, in so many words, this has to be the hair of Orestes, because it looks just like my own hair. Then another strange thing happens. She sees the footprints near the shrine that belong to Orestes and Pylades, and she sees that one set of footprints perfectly matches her own. And thus she says, well, it must be my brother's footprint. But then, when Orestes steps out from behind the tomb, he does not immediately recognize Electra, and she does not immediately recognize him. It is only because Electra's mourning seems genuine, compared to the ritual mourning of the Libation Bearers, that Orestes determines, this must be my sister Electra. Her grief is real. She must be the daughter of Agamemnon. That is what distinguishes her from these other women. And so he approaches her, and he identifies himself. But even then, Electra does not recognize Orestes. Even after having looked at the locks of his hair and determined immediately, well, this must be the hair of Orestes, she doesn't recognize that very same hair when it is on his very head, right in front of her. And as he's trying to tell her and convince her that he is Orestes, she says such things as, would you come to laugh at my pain? And he says, well, if I did that, I would only laugh at my own pain. She asks, is this a trap? Do you come to tie a net around me? And he says, I would tie a net around myself as well. The moment of recognition is when Orestes shows her a piece of cloth that was woven by her own hands and given to him at the day of his birth, perhaps a swaddling band. And at this moment of recognition, brother and sister share a moment together as they are reunited. So this whole incident, the mutual recognition of Orestes and Electra, is somewhat confusing. And actually the strangeness of this scene was not lost on Aeschylus's contemporaries or relative contemporaries. The tragedian Euripides pokes fun at this scene in his own play, Electra, which recounts the same events. In Euripides' play, when the locks of Orestes' hair are found and one of Electra's companions says, hey, look, that looks like your hair, maybe it belongs to Orestes, Electra dismisses that possibility and basically says, well, just because we're siblings doesn't mean our hair would be the same. And plenty of people have the same hair who aren't siblings. What a ridiculous conclusion to jump to. And the same thing with the footprints. In Euripides' play, Electra says, why would our footprints be the same? Generally, men have larger feet than women. Siblings don't always have the same size feet, and so on. A series of very rational objections to that, construing these things as evidence. And so, in Aeschylus, she jumps to the conclusion that Orestes must be here, based on the evidence that is questionable at best. But then, when she sees him in the flesh, she doesn't recognize him. This moment of mutual recognition has been debated and discussed a great deal. I'm not going to claim to give a definitive explanation. You can look more deeply into it if you'd like. For me, the key thing in understanding this scene would be something along these lines. Electra and Orestes are, in some metaphorical or allegorical sense, the same person. They are the male and female halves of the archetypal child, both responding to the murder of the archetypal father by the archetypal mother. Something I never noticed that Michael Davis points out is that both refer to Clytemnestra as a father killer, which is unusual because that's actually not her crime. Her crime is husband killing. And for us in the modern age, this is probably a weird distinction to make. We are enculturated to a modern sense of justice, and for us to attach a different significance to a murder depending on who is killed is a very strange idea. I mean, all of us can understand the unique ghoulishness of killing one's own parent, but it isn't charged as a different crime under the law. In our standards of justice, we don't have crimes such as parricide or matricide. One of our colloquial sayings that sort of gets at our modern conception of justice is blind. It doesn't matter who you kill. Murder is murder. But Electra and Orestes come from a different cultural context where it really matters who you killed, who you were in relation to that person, especially if they're a family member. The interesting thing is that they refer to Clytemnestra as though she is a parricide, a father killer, which is not the case. And so you could interpret this as the fact that in some way, because they're metaphorically almost like two halves of the same person, they share the same outlook, the same perspective, and they're so bound to this perspective that they can't imagine the crime from any perspective other than their own. So the crime their mother committed is interpreted from the standpoint as if they themselves did it. And so all of these points of strangeness in these early scenes in the Libation Bearers point to something really significant. These are archetypal characters, and what is it to be an archetypal character? The archetype is not a unique and specific particular person. They are a universal and timeless figure in some sense. Perhaps the fact that Orestes and Electra would not recognize one another by sight is because the story in some strange way is transcending the particularity of their existence, the particularity of their own stories, and becoming a universal narrative. So they recognize one another. How? By Electra's genuine grief, by the swaddling band of Orestes. So recognition, but not by physical appearance, not by recognition of the particularity of the individual, recognition by the unmistakable reality, oh, we are the children of the same father and mother. That's how they recognize one another. They recognize the reality, we are the son and daughter of Agamemnon who must get revenge for him. And likewise, there's a kind of strange unity in the characters, or an almost sort of magical connection in that all Electra has to do is go and pray for her brother, pray for him to come and take revenge. And like magic, there he is to come take revenge. And I think this interpretation of the archetypal transcending particularity helps to explain the unusual scene that follows, in which Electra and Orestes try and resurrect Agamemnon. They try to call him to rise from his grave. Agamemnon, come forth from the earth and take revenge. Avenge yourself. This does not work, obviously, and Orestes proceeds with his plan to do it himself. But why would they call the corpse of Agamemnon to resurrect in the first place? Why include this scene? There is a sense in which the father they're calling on is not really Agamemnon, but the cosmic father, Zeus. And beyond even the image of Zeus, there is sort of like the archetype of the father, which is beyond any one man or figure or even a god. So they're calling out to Agamemnon, but in a deeper sense, they're calling out to the patriarchal religious authority. And since Agamemnon, the particular character of Agamemnon, cannot rise from the dead, Orestes himself has to become the next iteration of that figure. He has to take on the role of the head of the house of the Atridae. And so for him, for Orestes, avenging Agamemnon is a rite of passage required for him in order to do this. And so the play proceeds. Orestes comes to the palace, and he presents himself as a stranger bearing the news of the death of Orestes. He tells Clytemnestra that he met a Phocian on the road who told him that during his exile Orestes died. Please let his parents know in Argos. Clytemnestra does not recognize Orestes, and she lets him into the palace. And she's not overjoyed at the news, because the circumstances as they had been arranged were such that Orestes could have lived out his life without such a confrontation ever needing to occur. We get the impression that this is what she wished would happen. That perhaps if Apollo had not told Orestes to take his revenge, that he could have just lived out his days in Phocis, and Clytemnestra could have lived out her days. So Clytemnestra fetches for Aegisthus, who wishes to interrogate Orestes face to face. During this scene, the chorus, the slave women who acted as Clytemnestra's libation bearers, cry out for justice, as they wait for Aegisthus to arrive. Quote, "Our cry is the cry of justice. Zeus, safeguard it well." End quote. Further down, they wish for Orestes, quote, "When your turn comes in the action, be strong. When she cries, son, cry out, my father's son. Go through with the murder, innocent at last. Raise up the heart of Perseus in your breast. And for all your love under the earth, and above its rim, now scarf your eyes against the Gorgon's fury. Go in for the slaughter now." End quote. When Orestes confronts Aegisthus, it is once again offstage, and he takes his revenge in precisely the way Apollo counseled him to do. It is exactly as Agamemnon was killed, with stealth, without warning, without explanation. Orestes dispatches Aegisthus. When Clytemnestra hears the shouting, she rushes to see what is going on, and she beholds the body of Aegisthus, and Orestes standing over it with a bloody sword in his hand. But Orestes then confronts his mother. He grabs her and drags her toward the body of Aegisthus and declares, quote, "You love the man? Then lie in the same grave. You can never be unfaithful to the dead." End quote. And at no point before this did either Orestes or Electra invoke the infidelity of Clytemnestra as her crime. That was, after all, her crime against Agamemnon, but not against them. To the two of them, her crime is father-killing. But now, Orestes, the heir to Atreus, has sort of taken up the mantle of Agamemnon. He is standing now as the archetypal father himself. He is standing as the avatar of the patriarchal law, the patriarchal authority, taking its revenge. And now, at that point, he throws that charge of adultery at her. Clytemnestra begs for her life. And for a moment, Orestes falters. She says to him, "How can you plunge a blade into the breast that nursed you?" And he turns to his friend Pylades and asks, "What should I do? I dread to kill my mother." And Pylades speaks his only lines in the whole play, where he tells Orestes, "Think of what Apollo told you. Think of the oath that you swore. Quote, 'Make all mankind your enemy, not the gods.'" End quote. And at hearing these words, Orestes resolves that, yes, I have to do this. It's still a painful bargaining process that occurs after this as Clytemnestra continues to plead. Quote, Clytemnestra, "I gave you life, let me grow old with you." Orestes, "What, kill my father, then you'd live with me?" Clytemnestra, "Destiny had a hand in that, child." Orestes, "This too, destiny is handing you your death." End quote. Clytemnestra promises him a mother's curse if he kills her, because after all, matricide is one of the worst crimes that someone can commit. But Orestes says the alternative is a father's curse, and he chooses his dead father over his living mother and stabs her to death. The chorus eggs him on in this. They're very much pro-Orestes, and at the end of the deed, they say that even though they feel pity for the slain, justice has finally come. A couple of observations here. For one, in his killing of Clytemnestra, Orestes does not necessarily obey what Apollo told him, at least not to the letter, as he did with Aegisthus. Instead, he confronts her, and they have this long back and forth where she pleads for her life. So he doesn't kill her in stealth. He kills her as part of this confrontation where he righteously reaffirms his commitment to get justice for his father. Furthermore, we might consider Pylades' words as emblematic of the undercurrent running throughout the work, of the competing interests, the competing conception of right, of the father versus the mother. The law of the civic gods versus the familial law. The father's right is always correlated with that of the civic gods, of the Olympians, of the city, and it is that law that Pylades sets in opposition to what he calls mankind. Make all of mankind your enemy before you make the gods your enemy. Because the father is the one with the commitment to civic life. That's the one who's charged with maintaining a pious relationship with the gods. Whereas the familial law is sort of like the original, the archaic law of mankind as a species, right? Your loyalty to your genome, so to speak. We see in the example of Agamemnon that this allegiance to the polity, to the civic life, to the moral fabric on which Greek society depends, his allegiance to the gods, to uphold and regulate that order, leads Agamemnon to do something which is ultimately inhuman. And so I think this explains the sort of the law of mankind standing for the sort of matriarchal ancient law of blood, and the law of guest and host and the law of Zeus standing for the patriarchal. So once again, the cycle repeats. Orestes does the same thing. He chooses the dictate of the god Apollo, Zeus's son, over the pleas of his living mother. And meanwhile, what does Clytemnestra do? She holds the right of the family above the civic life, above right in some abstract or ideal sense. And this is how she can react to Orestes the way she does. How she can say, well, no, please don't kill me. Let me grow old with you, which might seem like kind of a strange thing to say. But she says, I did what I did for your sister, Iphigenia. You don't have to do this. Apollo did tell Orestes, if you don't carry this out, you'll be cursed. But as we learn at the end of this play and in the events of the final act, the Eumenides, in reality, Orestes does carry it out, and he's still cursed. At the end of this play, he has his visions of the Furies. He is hounded by the Furies and driven insane. And so Apollo says you'll be cursed if you don't do this, but in reality he's cursed if he does do it. And so we might say, well, there's no way out. You're cursed if you do, and you're cursed if you don't. Why not choose the option where there isn't more bloodshed, and you don't have to kill your own mother? Why not take Clytemnestra up on her offer and say, you know what, I'm cursed either way. Sure, I'll spare your life. But no, Orestes has sworn an oath, and he's been sort of raised up by the Libation Bearers and by Electra, his sister, into this avatar of vengeance. And so what I'm trying to drive home here is that it might be easy to just sort of look at many of the actions that the characters take and say, well, it was commanded by a god, he had no choice. But I think it's very clear. Orestes does have a choice, and he chooses to continue the cycle. Now, the final play of the Oresteia, the Eumenides, is where I think things really start to get interesting. And I have to admit that it was discussing this part of the trilogy that I was really excited about when planning this episode. But we had to talk about the first two parts, because it doesn't work from a narrative standpoint unless you've experienced the first two parts of the series. If you have a good memory of the episode about Oedipus, or if you're just very familiar with Greek mythology yourself, you'll know that the name Eumenides is another name for the Furies. The name Eumenides specifically designates a certain aspect of the Furies, their benevolent side. Normally, the Furies are wrathful deities. This is what they are, and they have always been. The third and final play, in a way, is the origin story of how the Furies become welcome to Athens as benevolent spirits. In the course of the play, they have almost a total character change. And this happens after the first ever trial by jury in Athenian history, which establishes the practice of judging someone's guilt or innocence by a verdict of their peers. In this third act, the language has more or less entirely shifted. About halfway through the second play, the language moves away from the style of the beginning of the trilogy with its swirling metaphors and paradoxes, and moves toward language which is more conversational almost, down to earth. I wouldn't say realistic, just less abstract and poetic. And yet, in terms of its content, the Eumenides is, perhaps paradoxically, more allegorical in nature than even the previous two plays. And what I mean by that is, the narrative that has played out so far has really just been plotting, murder, distressed speeches, gloating over corpses, grieving, praying, more plotting, more murder. Really, it's all gritty, as they would say in Hollywood. It's unglamorous. The story itself is not fantastical, except for the background presence of prophecies and, the overall dread in the air. Really, it's like a sense that in the background of all of these mundane affairs, we're playing out this ancient story of vengeance. But in the Eumenides, the story itself becomes more fantastical. These archetypes move out of the background and they come straight into the foreground. So in the Agamemnon For example, the ancient legends of child killing and matricide and revenge begetting revenge manifest in the form of these particular characters. By the time of the Eumenides, most of the particular characters fall away, and the archetypal forces behind these two competing perspectives of justice or right manifest themselves as characters in the play. As deities, in fact. The main characters in the play are as much ideas as they are characters. On the one side, we have the god Apollo, and the Furies are on the other side. They both attempt to press their rights. The result is a trial, and it's judged by Athena, goddess of justice. These are really the main characters of the Eumenides: Athena, Apollo, and the Furies. Orestes is still a main character in the play, but he's the defendant. He becomes a passive figure in this third part. And once again, the chorus is different. In the first, it was the old men of Argos. In the second, the slave women. And in this third play, the chorus is the Furies themselves. And while it is open to interpretation as to why Aeschylus chooses the chorus that he does in the first two plays, here it is rather clear why the Furies are chosen. They are the driving force of the play. The Furies are the main characters. They're the only party involved that has a character arc, for one, and it is their insistence on pressing their right of vengeance that causes the events in the play. After a short prologue, the play begins at the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. There we learn that Orestes has been purified by Apollo of any wrongdoing. He has even restored Orestes' sanity. And yet the Furies have pursued him all the way to this temple, nevertheless. As the play begins, Apollo has woven a spell that has put all of the Furies to sleep. He then sends Orestes off to Athens. He tells him to beg the favor of the goddess Athena, and then Apollo departs as well. The Furies continue to sleep, but the ghost of Clytemnestra then appears. Clytemnestra laments the fact that her matricide has gone unpunished, and commands the Furies to awake and avenge her, that justice must be done, and ancient laws must be honored. The Furies eventually do wake up. They appear as old women, cloaked in black. They're described as similar to the Gorgons in terms of their appearance. They're frightful. They don't have the wings or snakes in their hair. Instead, they just have a gaze that seems to drip venom, breath that is sulfurous. They just ooze toxicity and vitriol. After they awake, they sort of renew their intentions to go after Orestes, and Apollo returns to the scene, and there's a brief confrontation between the two of them. They accuse Apollo of being more than a mere accomplice to the crime. Apollo defends his actions. He says that by enforcing their vengeance upon Orestes, they're letting the crime of Agamemnon's murder go unpunished. And, quote, "Marriage of man and wife is fate itself, stronger than oaths, and justice guards its life," end quote. A few lines down, quote, "I say your manhunt of Orestes is unjust," end quote. But the Furies see things differently, because the murder of a husband by a wife would, quote, "not destroy one's flesh and blood," end quote. The Furies reiterate their task is to drive matricides from their homes, to curse them, haunt them, eventually destroy them. And they vow they will never relent in this, and they will never let Orestes go free. What I love about this final play is in the fact that there are so many ways to interpret the first two parts of the Oresteia, and interpret the actions of the characters therein, and their motives, and whether what they did was right or wrong. The story of reciprocal violence is played out across the trilogy. Both forms of justice, both interpretations of right, have taken action against one another, we might say. The familial justice versus civic or religious justice, matriarchal versus patriarchal. It is as if these two principles in this scene have been embodied in order to debate the interpretation of the first two plays. So the concluding act of the story is a commentary on what happened in the first two parts of the story, which is fascinating because what happened before is not entirely clear from a moral standpoint or from a psychological standpoint. Did Agamemnon have to sacrifice his daughter, or did he simply think, well, if I turn back now, I'll be remembered as the weak king who mustered his ships but then called off the war, who was too scared to sacrifice his own daughter for the greater good? If that was part of his motivation, was it in some way an act of pride, even if it was also an act of piety, to appease the gods? Is that simply a post hoc rationalization? Did Clytemnestra act to avenge Iphigenia? I mean, surely that was part of it. But human action is not always so clear-cut. Perhaps some part involved those base adulterous motives that Orestes charges her with. Jealousy at the sight of Cassandra, the desire to, secure her own relationship with Aegisthus, which could never happen if Agamemnon returns. And did Orestes have to obey Apollo? Or could we interpret it such that he was cursed either way, and therefore he could have chosen to spare his mother's life if he really wanted to? Was one of his motives that same patriarchal pride? And so, reaching all the way back to the crimes of Atreus, or his father Tantalus, or the struggles between Zeus and Kronos, or Kronos and Uranus, there are these multiple interpretations of who was in the right, and who among us is to say which is correct. Both of these very powerful perspectives on justice will naturally be uncompromising, because when you feel you're in the right, naturally you will not budge. So how could we even possibly think of mediating between the two? How do you discover which one possesses the actual right when both stake a strong claim to being in the right? The law of reciprocal violence never solves this problem. Or rather, we might say, to the extent that this problem is solved, it's only ever solved by might makes right. But civic life necessarily has to subordinate that principle. One of the things the Furies say in this exchange with Apollo, and that they repeatedly bring up once the setting moves to Athens and they confront Athena, is that we are the older deities. You are the younger gods. You're part of that generation of deities spawned by Zeus, whereas we were born at the castration of Uranus. You cannot challenge our power. You're young upstarts. And so the Furies are an old, unchallengeable force from time immemorial. The duty to one's own blood. It supersedes even the oath of marriage, which Apollo says is beyond any other oath. Killing your own flesh and blood is the unforgivable sin, going all the way back to a time before anyone can remember. And, of course, it would be to a people whose religiosity is based in the family cult and in the belief of one's bloodline as a sacred thing. The Furies eventually do catch up to Orestes in Athens. They find him with his arms wrapped around the idol of Athena, praying to her. And they are about to set upon him, and they soliloquize about their task to carry out familial justice, the justice of blood. They invoke their origins as being creatures of Mother Night. They're this nocturnal force in contrast to the solar deity Apollo. And there's some very basic, I think, yin and yang type symbolism going on here, with night being personified in world mythology oftentimes as an essentially feminine force, and the sun as an essentially masculine force. And so the Furies say, and I'm going to abridge slightly with these verses, quote, This is our right, spun for us by the fates, the ones who bind the world, and none can shake our hold. Show us the mortals overcome, insane to murder kin. We track them down till they go beneath the earth, and the dead find little freedom in the end. Even at birth our rights were so ordained. The deathless gods must keep their hands far off. No god may share our cups, our solemn feasts. We want no part of their pious white robes. The fates who gave us power made us free. We brook no trial. No god can be our judge. End quote. We might notice another repeated theme of the Furies' ravings is that they're a kind of check on the dreams of grandeur held by men. And I think men here could be read literally as referring to gender as much as to mankind. It is the male sex that wishes for glory, that will stain their hands with blood in order to get it. And notice also that they have no interest in being holy and in the pieties and white robes of the Olympians. They have no interest in taking their claims to trial. The forms of justice or right upheld by the civic life, I mean, at best they have no use for these, and at worst it's almost an offense against them. Their justice is based on inviolate principles, and it's almost an insult to challenge these principles. But shortly thereafter, the real Athena arrives, and she declares that she has heard the pleas of Orestes from the other world. She asks the Furies why they're tormenting this man, and they say, matter-of-factly, he is a matricide. And she asks, why would he do such a thing? Did nothing force him to do it? Their answer is interesting. Quote, what spur could force a man to kill his mother? End quote. Regardless of whether somebody was spurring him on or whatever force is commanding him or pushing him, even if that happens to be the god Apollo, which they haven't revealed yet to Athena, none of that matters in some sense. It doesn't matter to them why he did it. It's incomprehensible to them that you would kill your own flesh and blood. It's like the question doesn't even compute. But Athena answers, quote, there are two sides here and only half is heard, end quote. And so she asks Orestes to explain himself. At first, she thinks that he's here because he wants to be purged and made pure again, but he says, no, I'm clean. Apollo has already purged me. I'm here because I need your help against the Furies. And he retells the story of the killing of his father by Clytemnestra. And he adds, quote, Apollo shares the guilt. He spurred me on. He warned of the pains I'd feel unless I acted, brought the guilty down. But were we just or not? Judge us now. My fate is in your hands. Stand or fall, I shall accept my verdict. End quote. Athena is truly at an impasse in how to judge this case, wise as she is. She says, the rites have cleansed Orestes of any harm he might do by being in her temple, because, it would be impious to have an impure person. But she seems to see the reason in Orestes' claim. And it's worth noting that in considering the side of the Furies, Athena does not seem all that convinced by the argument that they make for their case, so much as she is convinced by their insistence that they don't need a trial to act, and their threat that if Athena stops them, they will take vengeance on all of Athens. She says that their claim is hard to dismiss. Their ancient rite is hard to dismiss. But the reason why is that if their venomous pride is thwarted, they're going to cast plagues and blights upon the land. So hard to dismiss, indeed. Nevertheless, Athena says, this is beyond me. Both claims are strong. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to gather the finest men of Athens, and then you'll muster your best arguments before them, and they will decide whose claim is juster. Another interesting contradiction, or something open to interpretation, is that Athena says, quote, too large a matter, some may think, for mortal men to judge, end quote. So, too large a matter for mortal men to judge, but she delegates the task to who? 10 mortal men from Athens. She says that here we will establish a tradition for all time of setting up a tribunal to determine who has the just claim. So, is determining who is in the right beyond mortal men, or isn't it? Perhaps it is the gathering of multiple people with multiple perspectives that allows us to overcome this problem. We don't really know. It's interesting because the god herself says, this is beyond me. I can't decide. And yet, I'm going to leave the decision up to 10 mortal men. So it's a very interesting aspect of the Eumenides. And another thing is that we don't actually hear from the Athenian jurors. They have no lines of dialogue in the play. Aeschylus could have made the Athenian jurors the chorus. It would fit with the themes of Greek tragedy. The chorus is made up of some group of people from the city where the play takes place. But no, the Furies are the chorus. We have a voice for them. We have a voice for Apollo. We have Athena as the judge. We don't get any insight into what the jury is thinking, why they make their decision. In fact, aside from Orestes, who is a passive defendant in the case, we don't get much from any mortal at all. Before the trial begins, once again, the Furies threaten Athens if they should lose the case. They sort of say, okay, we'll go along with this, but if you rule against us, you know what's going to happen. And Apollo then arrives onto the scene, and he says, I'm here to stand as Orestes' advocate. Apollo is Orestes' defense attorney. And opposite the threats of the Furies, he offers Athena a bribe. Should the Athenians acquit Orestes, Apollo says, I will give my favor to the city, and I'll also secure the alliance of Athens and Argos. The trial then begins on the Areopagus. The Furies cross-examine Orestes, and he speaks on his own behalf at the beginning of the trial. But as they press their accusations, arguing again that, in spite of whatever crimes Clytemnestra may have committed, quote, the blood of the man she killed was not her own, end quote. And Orestes' blood, on the other hand, is undoubtedly that of his mother's, and Orestes can't deny this, and so he breaks under questioning. he defers to Apollo, and he says, quote, "Bear me witness, show me the way, Apollo. Did I strike her down with justice?" End quote. So, I've already made the argument there are so many ways for us to interpret the events as they have transpired so far. But even Orestes, a man who acted a key role in those events, doesn't know whether his own act was just or not. He begs a higher authority. Tell me if it was the right thing to do. Was I within my right to act? That's not the first time that Orestes expresses this sentiment. He said it earlier to Athena. He says, "You decide. I'll accept any verdict you give, innocent or guilty." Now, Apollo, of course, argues that Orestes' revenge was just. Apollo mounts his defense. He says, "I'm always honest. I have never lied." And he invokes as the source of his authority Zeus, the highest patriarchal figure. And the Furies press Apollo on this. They ask, "Did Zeus give you the command that you issued in your oracle to Orestes? Did Zeus tell you to tell Orestes to kill his own mother?" And Apollo doesn't actually answer this, which might make us a little suspicious. Instead, he brings up the murder of Agamemnon, which is the main event that his side would like to focus on. And Apollo says it would be one thing if he was killed by a woman in battle or by the arrow of an Amazon, but it's quite another thing to be slain by one's own wife, that one thought to be loyal, wrapped up in her web of cloth so you can't even defend yourself. So, Apollo makes some good points, but ultimately he dodges the question that the Furies asked him. And the Furies hone in on this point, his invocation of Zeus, and Apollo sort of sourcing as an argument from ethos his own authority to the authority of the Great Father. The Furies argue, well, Zeus himself overthrew and imprisoned his own father, Kronos. Sure, Zeus didn't kill him, but the Titans are deathless, so by throwing him down into Tartarus, he might as well have killed him. It's sort of the same fate as a mortal in the underworld anyway. The Furies argue, quote, "Doesn't that contradict you?" End quote. Apollo is enraged by this. He rants at the Furies and calls them grotesque and loathsome and says, quote, "The gods detest you," end quote. Apollo tries to argue that it is different what Zeus did, that ultimately chains can be broken, but not even the gods can bring back a mortal man once the earth has drunk up his blood. And essentially, I think the argument has kind of gone into the weeds here. I mean, we're arguing whether Zeus, the divine patriarchal authority, actually stands in any kind of moral position to judge based on whether or not chaining the Titans down in Tartarus is the same thing as killing a mortal man, when, in fact, it's not entirely clear that Zeus himself had any direct role in any of this conflict. I would also note, there's a sense in which Apollo, as the representative for civic life, is inevitably going to be put into the position of defending a somewhat contradictory position. Because the reality of civic life is that its ideals are never perfectly realized. The advantage of the Furies, and their disadvantage, is that there's no contradiction for them, no hypocrisy, pure, unadulterated wrath. That's it. Based on inflexible principles. Ultimately, Apollo makes a somewhat odd argument. The true begetter of the child is the male. He goes so far as to argue that the mother is just a vessel and the father the true progenitor. And his proof of this is Athena herself, born out of Zeus's head, without help from a woman. And, again, this would all seem to be quite orthogonal to the actual concerns of the case, except if we consider that this is sort of like the archetypal patriarchal versus the archetypal matriarchal. Only then does it make sense. Or, well, we could say it also makes sense as Apollo perhaps trying to appeal to Athena in that way, by saying, look, you were an example of how the male is the only true begetter. And it's at this point that Athena calls an end to a trial and asks the Athenian judges to cast their lots. Quite aside from the arguments concerning who was in the right, Apollo reiterates his bribe, and the Furies reiterate their threats. And then Athena, when she collects the urn of votes, does something else very strange and very remarkable. She throws in one additional lot for herself on the side of Orestes. It's sometimes said when people explain the plot of this play that the vote is a tie. and that Athena then has to cast a tie-breaking vote. And so she casts it on the side of the innocent. But first of all, that's not why Athena says she does it. She does not say that we should lean on the side of acquitting a guilty man than condemning an innocent man. She does not make an argument like that. Secondly, we don't actually know if the vote was going to be a tie. She casts her extra lot before she even counts the votes and says, if it is a tie, it will go to Orestes. And her actual explanation for why is quite incredible. Quote, I honor the male in all things but marriage. Yes, with all my heart I am my father's child. I cannot set more store by a woman's death. She killed her husband, guardian of their house. Even if the vote is equal, Orestes wins. End quote. So Athena explicitly says, I may be a woman, but I'm the daughter of Zeus and only Zeus. So she buys Apollo's arguments regarding this, and she says, I'm on the side of the men. And this may seem to be quite a crude reason for her favoring Orestes from our perspective. It might even seem to be unjust. And there is a sense in which this first jury trial is fundamentally unjust. But we have to keep in mind that what we're witnessing here is a symbolic, or we might say allegorical, retelling of the story of the establishment of civic justice through the creation of trial by jury, which is one of the key elements of that justice. And so Athena is the one who establishes this because she stands for that patriarchal version of justice, using the term patriarchal or male here in a symbolic or archetypal sense. The female principle of justice is the inflexible justice of the Furies. Put simply, you hurt my baby, I kill you. If you kill your own flesh and blood, you're condemned. But that's not Athena's principle of justice. She's a civic goddess. She's a goddess of the city of Athens. From perhaps a Jungian perspective, we could say she's only female insofar as she's the anima of Zeus, the soul that leapt out of Zeus's body, and that embodies Zeus's faculty of reason, the laws that govern civil life. And so she ultimately stands with Apollo and with his father Zeus and with Orestes. She is an outwardly biased judge. And so the case is decided for Orestes, who thanks her and declares, quote, O Pallas Athena, you save my house, end quote. It was Athena's intervention that breaks the curse of the Atridae, and not a fair trial. Orestes, presumably, returns to Argos to take up his throne and rule the city as an unpunished matricide. Obviously, the Furies are livid with rage, and they repeat their dialogue twice at the end of the play for two different sets of verses. Athena will say something, they will have their soliloquy, and then Athena will say something else, and then they'll just repeat the dialogue that they had before. And I think there's clear symbolism here. Rage is an emotion that puts you on a one-track mind, incapable of listening to what the other is saying, simply repeating your grievances over and over again in your head, how you've been wronged. Since the Furies embody that kind of rage, it's almost like they can't hear what Athena is saying, and they're just sort of repeating these same things. As Orestes departs for his kingdom, the Furies rage against the younger gods. They say that these younger gods have made a mockery of the ancient laws, and they renew their threat. They say, all right, well, we're going to poison your land. We're going to burn your fields into sterility in revenge for this injustice, which arguably, it is an injustice. So Athena answers them. The first thing she says is, she makes a threatening implication. In so many words, she says, look, I'm the only god besides Zeus who has the keys to Zeus's thunderbolt, so maybe think about that. But then she says, quote, let me persuade you. The lethal spell of your voice. Never cast it down on the land and blight its harvest home. End quote. The Furies express almost like a feeling of suffering at the disgrace in this incident. And then they repeat those verses again. But Athena continues to sort of work on them and to offer them an alternative. What if instead of cursing Athens, you come and live here as its protective deities? Quote, you will come to love this land, I promise you. As time flows on, the honors flow through all my citizens, and you, throned in honor before the house of Erechtheus. You will harvest more from men and women moving in solemn file than you can win throughout the mortal world. End quote. And almost unbelievably, through Athena's persuasive speech, the Furies slowly begin to relent. They ask, well, where is this home that will be ours to hold? Athena answers, quote, where all the pain and anguish end. Accept it, end quote. And they go back and forth for a bit longer, but eventually the leader of the Furies exclaims, quote, your magic is working. I can feel the hate, the fury, slip away, end quote. And so in this amazing turn of events, the dialogue of Athena and the Furies turns to the topic or the theme of joy and blessings. It's a very unusual end to a Greek tragedy in that way, by the way, because even though the events leading up to the end of the Eumenides have undoubtedly been tragic, the ending itself is actually not tragic. The ending itself is actually very optimistic in a way. The Furies state their intentions to turn away from their wrathful nature, being this avenging, dark, feminine force, and they say instead, we'll take our joy in the scene of a young woman embracing her lover. Athena promises them bountiful sacrifices from the Athenians, and the Furies rejoice. They repeatedly say, we shall nestle under the wings of Pallas Athena, blessed with the love of the father, Zeus. The Furies say, quote, the brutal strife, the civil war devouring men, I pray that it never rages through our city. No, that the good Greek never drinks the blood of Greeks, shed in an orgy of reprisal of life for life. That fury, like a beast, will never rampage through the land. Give joy in return for joy. One common will for love, and hate with one strong heart. Such a union heals 1,000 ills of man. End quote. This is how the Furies become the Eumenides, and the play ends with the women of Athens coming forward to praise the Eumenides and sing the blessing of, quote, you great good Furies who bless the land with kindly hearts, end quote. So the Furies, again, they undergo a complete character change. That's almost unbelievable if we weren't dealing within the realm of, gods and magic. So what are we to make of the end of the Oresteia? On the one hand, the trilogy concludes with a mediation between the old law of justice and the new, sort of a reconciliation between the familial code and the civic code, between chthonic feminine and solar masculine, and between the old gods and the new. But as we've mentioned, Athena tips the scales. She tips them in favor of Orestes. Ultimately, then, we have to reckon with the fact that the first jury trial of Athens, that establishes their legal traditions and the rights of the accused, results in the acquittal of a matricide. Perhaps more importantly for us, trying to interpret the play, all of those questions of interpretation that I raised before do not seem as though they've actually been settled. Because throughout this entire trilogy, it's never been clear that any of the parties carrying out what they call justice have actually been disinterested. It's not clear that we have ever had a judge who, under the normal rules, the oath to be impartial, wouldn't have had to recuse themselves if they were being honest. Whether it was Clytemnestra carrying out justice for her daughter, or Orestes carrying out justice for his father, or Athena securing justice for Orestes. All the parties are interested parties. I said at the very beginning that this trilogy is the journey from savagery to civilization, that it is a trilogy about breaking the cycle of reciprocal violence. And the Furies, as they transform into the Eumenides, upon essentially being bribed by Athena, say as much. Let us just simply end this all-consuming violence that sparks endless new acts of retribution. But in practical terms, how does one end this cycle? There is a sense in which it must end, quote-unquote, unjustly. Because at some point, in order to end it, we have to simply say, this just ends. This latest crime will not be avenged if we are to have peace. We have to bury the hatchet, admit there was wrongdoing on all sides, just let the dead rest. And so that's one possible interpretation of these events, that at a certain point, it just has to stop. Irrationally, unjustly, arbitrarily, it just stops. But that necessarily means that on the foundation of a sort of irrational and arbitrary, and therefore unjust act, justice can begin, real justice. We stop following those inflexible old laws of blood. And why? Simply because we have suffered enough under them. And this is the wiser course of action. That is the Greek principle known as pathematos, learning through suffering. The chorus says in the first play, Agamemnon, quote, Zeus, who guided men to think, has laid it down, that wisdom comes alone through suffering, end quote. And so that is the very straightforward sense in which the play is a movement from savagery to civilization. We suffered through the birth pangs of the law of vengeance until we attained wisdom. And Athena and Apollo are able to end it by wisely saying, let's all come together and prosper together as one. As the Furies say at the end of this play, love and hate with a single heart. And that means that the Furies, that old law of blood and retribution, are always there beneath the earth, beneath the foundations of that civic life. But we haven't quite brought out what I would say is the most important aspect of this unfair trial in which Athena puts her finger on the scale for Orestes. I think we can look at it this way. This trial, sanctioned by the gods, sets the precedent that the jury is allowed to let a guilty man go free, or punish an innocent man. We rarely think about that implication in sort of upholding and uplifting our own legal system as the ideal, because the point of the legal system, when it's working, is to punish the guilty and free the innocent. But the reality is we're fallible. We're not gods. Even the gods can't fairly judge according to the worldview of the Greeks. And if there are these ancient familial commitments to violence and vengeance on behalf of one's kin, how could you ever call a jury trial? If one were to call a jury trial under such a law, what you would actually be calling people to participate in by being a juror would be a very dangerous and fraught enterprise. No one would want to do it, because any juror who gave a verdict under the old law, the law of the Furies, would always be fearful that if they gave the wrong verdict, the Furies would come after them. And that is the threat made by the Furies themselves in the play. Well, sure, you have your trial, but if you get it wrong, we're going to come after you. By arranging this very flawed trial, Athena arranges it so that people can be fallible and give the wrong verdict, and the Furies will not take their revenge. Because what is essential for the legal system to begin to function as intended is that the people who make decisions within it must be allowed to make mistakes. There's actually great importance to the fact that the trial is not fair, and that it isn't entirely clear that Orestes shouldn't have been punished. But if we're going to place the right of judgment into the hands of men, then we have to let them be human beings. These decisions cannot be taken under coercion of inflexible principles and blood oaths and the right of vengeance and so on. And so what follows from all of this is that we shall allow people to have incompatible perspectives on what is right. We shall always be interested parties. The fascinating thing about the Eumenides is that it doesn't promise that we get beyond that. That is, after all, the world according to the sophists. A clash of perspective, a clash of competing views on what is best, and a clash that's to be fought out in the public arena of debate. The innovation, therefore, that is achieved or sort of dramatized in the Eumenides is not that we reach an ideal standard of objectivity when it comes to judging human affairs. And furthermore, the Oresteia is not to be understood as a story about mercy overriding revenge, as it is sometimes simplistically interpreted. It is not to be likened to the Christian revaluation in which the innocence of the accused is proclaimed. It's worth noting the Christian interpreter René Girard noticed this in his own reading of the Oresteia. The final play does not put an end to what Girard calls the scapegoating process, because, as the Furies say, their goal is for all the people of the city to come together in both love and hate with a single heart. The Oresteia does not subvert, but rather exemplifies the pagan religious world, as Girard saw it. Rather than violence running out of control and spilling into civil war, we'll be unified. And the point of the Oresteia, then, is to move from the position of the Agamemnon, in which the chorus cannot judge and splits into 12 separate men, all of whom are confused and disunited in their understanding. In the Eumenides, even though it's a split decision, the people are now united in honoring the decision, even if it's wrong and fallible, and we're all interested parties. So they're divided in their perspectives, but they remain as one people, because the institution of the trial has been sanctified by the divine. This means justice as decided by men, however flawed, has been sanctified. And that means, therefore, the rite of passage, moving from these inflexible laws of taboo and just obeying the whims of the gods and prophecies and ancient traditions that have been handed down, which are all, again, in that category of the inflexible principle. The Agamemnon represents the state of consciousness in which men are overawed by reality, by the caprice of nature. It is the state of human development in which we understand the world as the domain of gods, whose laws we must follow without question, and that we don't really truly understand. And so at this point in human development, the infancy of human reason, people are sort of unable to act out justice or even conceive of justice as anything other than inflexible religious law. But by the time we get to the end of the third play, the new gods have taken justice from the old gods and have given it to mankind, in full acceptance of what that means. It doesn't result in rational mercy because mercy is good. Instead, it is an irrational mercy which is undertaken for the sake of stopping the old cycle, grinding the wheel of revenge to a halt. It is in fact an arbitrary injustice that establishes justice by placing the right of retribution within the hands of individuals. In short, Athena gives the Athenians the right to judge. In order to do this, that means that mankind is going to have to judge according to context. That is the essence of moving from barbarism to civilization. For man to stop reasoning strictly from divine command and begin reasoning from his own wisdom. In fact, man can only have recourse to his own particular wisdom. That is the triumph at the end of the Eumenides. It is the wisdom that has been attained at the cost of great suffering. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.